Hello, my name is Jeff Young, author and editor with Fortress Publishing, and occasionally, as an author, you don't get to write what you want to write. Sometimes an editor or a publisher will come to you with an image and ask you to possibly come up with a story that fits that image, like the cover for the magazine that you just saw, Trail of Indiscretion. And I needed to come up with a story that had something to do with what's looming right over my head, the Medusa. So this sort of became a kitchen sink story where I started with Medusa and I added a ton of other things from that time period. So we'll talk a little bit about those whenever we get done reading the story. But this is Look Upon My Works. Linnaeus used to believe that crouching over the Pegasi as the Judean priests sawed away at its white neck was the worst thing that could happen. Together they had convinced the wealthiest man in the surrounding lands that they could safeguard his treasure, and their research into the story of the Gorgon convinced them that the creature still lived inside the body of this white horse. With a beautiful virgin, some fermented apples, and a well-placed net, Pegasus had fallen to their trap. Forced into a large crate, it and Linnaeus's cohort had sailed across the seas to the barren lands to the south, the new home of their benefactor, Ozymandias. After Linnaeus helped Judean free the Gorgon from the Pegasus, the weakly flopping form, sheened in dark viscous blood, mewed pitifully. With a ripple of its serpentine body, it had disappeared into the depths of the labyrinth, the winding maze hidden under the desert beneath the boundaries of the salted lands of Carthage and the Nile cities. The monster was swiftly followed by the disciple of Daedalus that Ozymandias had hired to design the subterranean prison for his watchdog. Both of the men turned towards their employer, and the look on his face stopped any thoughts of objection. "Death to any man who would have my treasure," cried Ozymandias, and the blazing sun shone off the sweat on his face, making him glow like the madness was burning through his skin. Linnaeus had stood by then, silent, bought by the gold that had liberally poured into his hands. He had never asked about its strange rough quality, as though it might have been melted from some identifiable coinage. He had never questioned when Ozymandias bade him take his cohort forth and capture the tribe of Judeans that the priest had called family. In fact, he did little these days but hold his tongue and desperately search for a way to escape, to keep what he had acquired and not be swallowed by the black mouth of the labyrinth. The priest looked at him now, and then mouthing curses, calling the wrath of his single puny god down upon high to make Linnaeus suffer. More and more of his tribesmen had disappeared into the labyrinth as they refused to work the buildings and the temples that Ozymandias had envisioned. Early on, they had learned the Gorgon liked to play with its prey. The screams echoing through the glistening black corridors made the laborers quail in their traces as they hauled the huge blocks of stone over rollers of stripped lumber. Already the enormous black feet of the statue to his employer were rising above the horizon. Gold flowed out of the labyrinth into the hands of the caravaneers, assuring the continuation of trade. Water rose from the spring, and the Judeans used it liberally on the farm plots that were planted. Game came into the area drawn by the farms, and the Judeans' goats' herds grew fat and sleek. For a time, all was proceeding according to the madman's plan. Linnaeus watched as Ozymandias' city grew. His land prospered and his gold remained safe. And then the priest vanished. Now, as Ozymandias stood over him, gesturing vehemently, Linnaeus turned to his cohort and sent a third of his men to their deaths. As the desert sun beat down on the black stone courtyard of the oasis, Linnaeus watched them thunder down the stairs into the depths of the labyrinth. And for a moment he stood there on the verge of the 3-cubit fall, the sweat running from his hand down the blade of his falcata to shine on his blade. And then suddenly he could no longer stand by. All the things that were happening to him he could no longer allow. He had been a man of action and had become soft like the gold with which he was paid. Turning out, he lashed with his blade, slicing Ozymandias behind his ankle, and in the same motion leapt into the darkness. Finding his feet, Linnaeus turned towards the round opening before him. A fallen torch guttered on the floor, and he scooped it up. All around him were silent stone figures, but each of them lay in various positions on the floor. None were whole. They were missing limbs, or massive trauma was evident to their body. These were the leavings of the Gorgon, its unfortunate meals. Stumbling around them, he pushed forward. He could hear the sounds echoing madly through the labyrinth. His men were well trained. They would stay together. They would want to use a phalanx, but the width of the corridor would not allow it. For a moment he thought about the others of his cohort left behind. He did not doubt that they would soon follow him. There was a loud noise that sounded like metal being torn apart, and a shield and spear flew through the air from a side corridor to strike the wall before him. He pushed his falcata into his belt and reached down for the shield, crouched behind it, and then scurried past the opening. He had found the Gorgon. The figure of a stone man sailed across the corridor behind him to strike the wall, dislodging the black brickwork. The statue, once one of his men, shattered, its limbs and head rolling in different directions. Linnaeus took to his feet, and dodging the stone figures scattered here and there, ran deeper into the labyrinth. Perhaps, if he could lead the monster away from his men, he could save some of them. The round bricked corridors felt endless. There was something that was bothering him about the victims of the Gorgon, but he was running so fast that it took all of his concentration to keep avoiding obstacles. Behind him, he could hear shattering stone. There was a horrendous scraping sound as well, and over all of it the sound of a heavy body slithering across the brickwork of the corridors. It was a primal sound that wanted to freeze him in his steps, but he pushed ever onwards. And then he stumbled into a courtyard. 10 of the passageways emptied into a common circular space. Lintels were built over each entrance, and all were dark holes, untouched by the light of his torch. He swung the shield around to the front now, hoping to blind the monster as it entered. But for all the noise of its passage faded away into silence. Linnaeus turned slowly about in place, facing the doorways, his sandals splashing in a pool of water that drained to this low place. Where was it? He could no longer tell. The torchlight danced in reflection at his feet. Maybe it was the motion there that made him see the beast before it lunged. The image of the Gorgon looming out of one of the doorways, its immense clawed hands on either side of the lintels wavered in the surface of the pool. Linnaeus threw himself to one side, the shield sliding around to protect his body. The heavy creature slammed into the bricks where he had just recently stood. Closing his eyes, he swung the torch around and struck the serpent-covered head a heavy blow. He felt the weight of the torch lessen as the flaming tar adhered to the monster. And even as it fought to right itself, more of the serpentine body kept rolling, coil after coil after coil, into the courtyard. Linnaeus reached for his blade. The falcata slipped into his grip, and leading with the shield, he made stab after stab into the immense body next to him. When he felt the head strike his shield, its fangs punching through the leather and metal, he turned, switching his grip on the falcata. Dropping the shield, he put both hands on the pommel. Looking only at the black-scaled back, he judged his blow and shoved the blade deep into the creature, and then wrenched it swiftly to the side. There was a moment of hesitation, and then the release as the spine severed. The coils then upon coils of its immense bulk began to frantically writhe on the stone floor. Linnaeus found himself tossed aside into one of the doorways. He pulled himself slowly to his feet, careful to avoid looking at the scene of death behind him. At the limit of his vision, in the hallway ahead, was a bright spark that looked like a torch. He stumbled onward, occasionally striking yet another maimed stone form or falling over their outstretched limbs. And in the darkness, still pursuing the torch bearer, his mind finally revealed what he had noticed. None of the victims he discovered were dressed as Judeans. Somehow the tribesmen had avoided the depredations of the monster. But how was that possible? He had seen dozens thrown down the stairs. And as he considered this quandary, the torch-bearer head came to a stall. There was a moment when the torch moved briefly back and forth, and then the light vanished. His quarry must have found a door, thought Linnaeus as he redoubled his pace. His outstretched fingers met the edge of a doorway, bringing him to a halt. He felt blindly across its surface until he found a bar at waist height. Sliding across, he was able to push the wooden door back to reveal a small entry to yet another courtyard. Here several torches lit the surrounding space, which was laid out in sumptuous decor. And at a table sat an old man with his hands clasped before him and thumbs resting on his lower lip. All of the furnishings were gold. In fact, there was nothing in the entire room that was not gold. Linnaeus stopped. He knew who sat before him. And suddenly, all of it made sense. The soft, unshaped gold, Ozymandias having a constant supply without mining for more, the labyrinth, the Gorgon. They were not only meant to keep out treasure seekers, but also to keep in the most dangerous of men. Midas looked up at him briefly and smiled. Linnaeus brought the falcata around in front of him in a defensive swing. Out of the darkness in the far corner of the room stepped the Judean priest, and with him slowly came a crowd of stone men. Each bore a mark on their foreheads written in ash. Just as he recognized Midas, so did Linnaeus recognize the Judean magic of the golem. The priest had an entire stone army down here. If he could but gather his men, he might be able to stop the Judean, but already the priest was grinning in a most unpleasant fashion. He walked towards Linnaeus, his hands clenching and unclenching. Not waiting, Linnaeus leapt towards Midas, his falcata outstretched, but the old king was quick and wise. He turned aside and, stretching out a finger, touched the passing blade, and it grew warm in Linnaeus's hand briefly, and then shone like the sun in reflected light. Already it bent slightly, the pure gold too soft to hold its shape, when swung through the arc. And in that moment the staff of the Judean priest slashed out and caught him a sharp blow at the head, taking the feet from under him. Linnaeus felt himself fall, and his hands were not quick enough to catch him as he struck the floor, and the light faded, and consciousness fled. When he awoke, there was gold dust footprints in the sand ahead of him. And when he finally struggled to his feet, Linnaeus's head throbbed and his vision was blurry, but he could see the line of stone men laden with gold and heavily burdened camels as they faded from sight. And when he looked back, he could just make out the oasis. Judean and his people were wavering dots now. Certainly he could follow the trail left by Midas, but not without water. All he could do now was return back to the oasis. And there he found his men slowly trying to restore order to the remains of the encampment. All of the goats, with the exception of the kids, were taken or slaughtered and skinned. The crops still remained as well, but the unfinished temple. As Linnaeus walked by the enormous black stone feet and their enigmatic inscription, he thought about how carefully the priest must have planned. Until the goats grew up enough to be skinned for water hides, his cohort could not leave the oasis. That gave the Judean, whose people were very familiar with the hardships facing them, a very comfortable opportunity to vanish once again. Linnaeus knew he was being given a second chance to redeem himself to his men, and swiftly set about making plans to leave as soon as possible. There was still gold for the taking, and all the cohort would be well paid. When Linnaeus asked after Ozymandias, he found the madman gone. Linnaeus suspected that he had followed the golden footprints out into the desert, limping slowly until he too vanished. And that was Look Upon My Works, which to my description was Kitchen Sink Story, because I was handed an image of Gorgon to start with, and I decided to go around and find things from that time period and add them together to try and, build the bones and the framework of the story. And obviously Gorgon was the first thing that I was handed, and the Gorgon, its death actually released Pegasus in certain versions of the story whenever its head was cut off by Perseus. So I started thinking about the idea of, well, if you cut the head off Pegasus, would you get another Gorgon? And it would be much easier to run around with a Pegasus under your control rather than trying to control Gorgon. So the labyrinth is actually designed by a disciple of Daedalus, which is a Greek myth, and inside the labyrinth is Midas, and that's where Ozymandias is getting his gold from. Spare a brief moment to talk about Ozymandias, because there's another strange character who is based on the idea of the famous line, "Look upon my works, ye mighty, and despair," which is from Percy Shelley, piece of poetry. There's also the Judean priest and his tribe of people, which happens to just be the lost tribe of Israel. So wondering where they got to, they were involved in this gold making business. They also, conveniently enough, bring along the idea of the golem. So you can actually have a stone army. At one point in time, I was actually even considering having the golems being turned into gold, so you didn't even have to carry the gold. The gold just literally walked for you. But apparently I decided not to use that. Anyway, that's the story. Thanks again for joining me. And right now is a great time to, if you're looking for something to read, my book Spirit Seeker by eSpec Books is only 99 cents, and any of the anthologies that contain my stories, or my works, if you will, are also 99 cents from eSpec Books.